Alright, this is Quiz 7, Study Guide, and the explanations. Problem number 1 asks for the simplest form of the square root of 98. Some of these are starting to look familiar to you, I hope. Square root of 98 is equal to the square root of 49 times the square root of 2, which is 7 radical 2. Number 2 is the square root of 200. The square root of 200 is the same as the square root of 100 times the square root of 2, which is 10 radical 2. The square root of 500. Again, that's the square root of 100 times the square root of 5, which is 10 radical 5. Number 4 is the square root of 45. Square root of 45 factors to the square root of 9 times the square root of 5, which is 3 radical 5. Number 5, square root of 192. The square root of 192 is equal to the square root of 64 times the square root of 3. The square root of 64 is 8, and times radical 3. Number 6, the square root of 25h squared. We break this apart into the square root of 25 times the square root of h squared. These are both perfect squares. The square root of 25 is 5. The square root of h squared is h. So 5h is your simplest radical form. Number 7, square root of 121a to the 8th. When you break this apart, you get the square root of 121 times the square root of a to the 8th. Again, these are both perfect squares. The square root of 121 is 11. The square root of a to the 8th is a to the 4th. Number 8 is the square root of 80a to the 6th. When you break this apart, you get the square root of 80 times the square root of a to the 6th. The square root of 80 is equal to the square root of 16 times the square root of 5 times the square root of a to the 6th is the perfect square. That's equal to a to the 3rd. The square root of 16 is equal to 4. So you've got 4 times a to the 3rd, which is 4a to the 3rd, times the square root of 5. Number 9, the square root of 125c to the 3rd. All right, this factors to the square root of 25 times the square root of 5 times the square root of c squared times the square root of c. Your 25 is a perfect square, and your c squared is a perfect square. So outside of this radical, you'll have 5 times c, which is 5c. And inside the radical, you'll also have 5 times c, which is 5c. Number 10, square root of 160 c to the fifth. The 160 factors to the square root of 16 times the square root of 10. The c to the fifth factors to the square root of c to the fourth times the square root of c. 16 is a perfect square, and c to the fourth is a perfect square. So outside the radical you have 4c squared, and under the radical you have 10 times c. Number 11. Square root of 75. H squared k to the third. Okay, the 75 factors to the square root of 25 times the square root of 3 times the square root of h squared, which is a perfect square, times the square root of k to the third will factor to the square root of k squared times the square root of k. And now you can simplify your perfect squares. The square root of 25 is 5. The square root of h squared is h. And the square root of k squared is k. So outside the radical you have 5hk. And inside the radical you have 3 times k, which is 3k. There's your simplest form. Number 12. Square root of 490. A squared b to the fourth. The 490 will simplify to the square root of 49 times the square root of 10 times the square root of a squared times the square root of b to the fourth. Your perfect squares are the 49, the square root of 49 is 7, the square root of a squared is a, and the square root of b to the fourth is b squared. So outside the radical you have 7a b squared, and inside the radical you have 10. Number 13. 3 radical 4 times the square root of 10. Alright, in this case your 4 is a perfect square, so you've got 3 times the square root of 4 is 2 times the square root of 10, which is 6 radical 10. Number 14. Negative square root of 10 times square root of 4. The square root of 4, again, is a perfect square. It's equal to 2. Don't forget this negative sign. It means negative 1. So you got negative 1 times 2, which is negative 2 times the square root of 10. Number 15. 3 times the square root of 9p to the third times the square root of 21p to the third. Okay, so let's put this problem back together, and you're going to get 3 times the square root of 9 times 21, 189. And p to the third times p to the third is p to the sixth. So now we put it together. We're going to take it back apart and factor it. So we got 3 times square root of 189 times the square root of p to the sixth. So we got 3 times the square root of 189. The largest perfect square that goes into 189 9 goes 21 times, so the square root of 9 times the square root of 21 times the square root of p to the 6th. So simplify your perfect squares. The square root of 9 is equal to 3, and the square root of p to the 6th is equal to p to the 3rd. So now multiply your numbers that are outside the radical, which is 3 times p to the 3rd. So you got 9p to the 3rd. Inside the radical, you've got the square root of 21. Number 16. Okay, again, this negative 1 in front of, or this negative sign in front of the radical is the same as the negative 1. Now, under the radical, put this back together. 9 times 15 is 135. A to the 3rd times a is a to the 4th. So take negative 1 times the square root of 135 times the square root of a to the 4th. And the largest perfect square that goes into 135, 9 goes 15 times. So you got the square root of 9 times the square root of 15 times the square root of a to the 4th. And now simplify your perfect squares. Your square root of 9 is equal to 3. Your square root of a to the 4th is equal to a squared. Outside of the radical, you got negative 1 times 3 times a squared is negative 3a squared. And under the radical, you have the square root of 15. Okay, again, this problem is apart, so let's put it back together. You got your 3 times 3 is 9. Then, underneath the radical, you got 10 times 15, which is 150, and you've got h times h to the 3rd, which is h to the 4th. So take your 9 times your square root of 150 times your square root of h to the 4th. 9 times the square root of 150 is going to be the square root of 25 times the square root of 6 times the square root of h to the 4th. Simplify your perfect squares. The square root of 25 is 5, and the square root of h to the 4th is h squared. So now your values outside the radical. You got 9 times 5 times h squared, which is 45 h squared. And under the radical, you've got the square root of 6.